Hello again. We're getting started on our first lecture from Chapter 7 from the Barber and Wright textbook. We're going to be discussing the presidency in this chapter, and I'll try to do this in about 4 or 5 brief 10-minute lectures. You should be looking at your notes right now. I'm just going to remind you what slide we're on at the appropriate time. We're going to start on slide 2 with learning objectives in this section. I want to talk about something the authors of your textbook introduced, and this is the idea of a double expectations gap. And it means a couple of different things, mostly that presidents promise a lot as candidates, but as elected presidents, they find once in office that working with Congress and getting things even through the courts at time and changing public opinion can affect what they can actually deliver once they're in office. We'll look at the evolution of the American presidency, which certainly is very different than it was in 1789 when George Washington became president. The powers of the president have expanded greatly, not so much because we've changed the Constitution, but because circumstances have changed. In amending the Constitution with respect to the executive branch, the powers of the president have been diminished, mostly by term limits, amending the Constitution to limit presidents and no other elected official on the federal level to just 2 terms in office. We'll talk about what some of those reasons for changes in condition that expanded the power of the presidency once in office. The powers of the president also depend, as we'll see at the end of this chapter, on individual personality. All 44 of the men who have served as president basically given the same constitutional powers, but some proved to be more powerful than others. I say 44 men. I realize that we've had 45 presidencies, but one of our presidents, Grover Cleveland, actually served 2 non-consecutive terms. So there are 44 individuals and 45 presidencies in the history of the United States. Presidents struggle for power, mostly with Congress, with the legislature, and things, obviously go better for presidents when their party controls both houses of Congress. They can usually get what they want. Some of our most successful presidents, like FDR and others, were in a position like that where they could get what they needed, what they wanted from Congress, and have the support of the federal court systems as well. The president is the head of the executive branch, Article 2 cabinet offices and the executive branch agencies, that technically every one of them works for the president. At the top, in the appointed positions, the secretary, deputy secretary, undersecretaries, most of those people are selected by the president. Most of the rank and file that make up the executive branch are civil service employees. They don't serve as the pleasure of the president. They serve because of their competence or skill in some particular policy area. And then we'll talk a little bit about something I'm very interested in, is the role of presidential character. James David Barber has suggested many years ago that successful presidents had certain character traits that made them better than their successors, the people that followed them. So we'll talk about that as well. Slide 3 now. The double expectations gap. We're getting into election season now. The Democratic primary looks like it's winding down, and Joe Biden will probably be the Democratic Party nominee. But between now and November, the individuals running for president from both political parties are going to make a lot of promises. The incumbent president, current president, is going to continue on his promises to continue what he's been doing in terms of infrastructure, building the wall, and other things like that. And his challenger, Joe Biden, will undoubtedly make promises as well, some of which come from the Democratic Party itself, and some are things that Joe Biden wants to do for the country. So in doing this, different factions, labor, farmers, business, teachers like myself, we all have personal interests that we would like to see the president follow through on. And we hope he'll do those things, and that's why we give him our vote. On the other hand, once in office, all presidents discover that they have relatively few formal powers. And without the cooperation of Congress to achieve their agenda, that's not going to happen. Some presidents, like Ronald Reagan, and I think Bill Clinton would be another example, were pretty successful in working with a Congress where their party did not have a majority. Others really struggled with that. So that's the double expectations gap. We expect the president to give us the moon, the stars, and all those things, and all the things we want him to deliver on. But once in office, they find they have very few formal powers to do that. So the question is, how do presidents do that? How do they? Why are some presidents more likely to achieve what they've promised in a campaign, and why some are not as successful? Going to slide 4 now. Constitutional powers of the presidency. Legislative powers are unusual with respect to a presidential as opposed to a parliamentary type system where the prime minister and his cabinet basically are the government, and they can work very closely with the legislature. In fact, the prime minister and his cabinet, they're all members of the House of Commons. And so if they don't get everything they want, everything they've promised on, it's pretty much considered to be a failure because they are, for all intent and purposes, the executive and the legislative branch rolled into one. Works a little differently for the president. His legislative powers are somewhat limited. It's very unusual for the president to go up in person and speak to members of Congress. One of the big exceptions to that, of course, is the State of the Union address. The president is required by the Constitution to yearly give a report on the State of the Union. And most of the time, it's pretty rosy. I remember when Gerald Ford was president, we were in the middle of a recession, that he gave a very grim assessment of the State of the Union. But really what it boils down to, and I think I mentioned this in class the other day, it boils down to a Christmas list. I want this. I want a pony. I want a unicorn. I want a new car, whatever it is you guys ask for these days. I always wanted a sled or a bicycle. Sometimes I got it. Sometimes I didn't. The president's not required to make this address in person. The first president to start doing that on a regular basis was Woodrow Wilson. And now this has turned into a big public event where it's more of a kind of almost like a campaign rally than it is a serious discussion of what the needs of the United States are at any given time. Presidents can also exercise another legislative power, and this is maybe one of their more powerful ones, and that's the legislative presidential veto, which is shared by governors of all states. In the case of the President of the United States, a bill cannot become a law without his signature, his approval. If he vetoes or rejects a bill, it goes back to both houses of Congress, where it has to, in the exact same format as it was submitted, and by a 2/3 vote, they can override his veto. Another way vetoes can take place is the so-called pocket veto, where the president receives a bill and he really doesn't want to sign it. Congress is about to adjourn for its session. If he does not sign it within 10 days of it being on his desk, or Congress leaves office before he has a chance to sign it, more specifically, then the bill fails. So any bill that reaches the president's desk during the 116th Congress, if he does not approve it at the end of the session, the bill dies on his desk. It can be resubmitted in the 117th Congress. Oftentimes, just the threat of a veto will bring about compromise. If the president says, this bill reaches my desk, I'm going to veto it, it might cause the leadership of the House and Senate to work a little closer and work out the differences in the bill to get the president's approval. Starting with Ronald Reagan and continuing with Bill Clinton, presidents have asked for an amendment to the Constitution to allow them to exercise something called a line item veto. And this is not surprisingly a power that as governor of California, Ronald Reagan, and as governor of Arkansas, Bill Clinton had. And that would be to veto out specific provisions within a bill without deleting the whole thing. The president gets, say, a defense appropriation bill, and he doesn't like, something in it. He has to either accept or reject the entire bill. I know in the case of Arkansas, that veto can be, a line item veto can be overturned by a simple majority of both houses, the House and Senate. But with going on to slide 5 now, presidential vetoes, Roosevelt to Obama. Not too surprisingly, presidential vetoes historically have been sustained. In fact, 93% overall sustaining vetoes in presidential history. If you look at the chart or the table 7.1, you'll see that most presidents have done a pretty good job, been pretty successful in getting their vetoes sustained. There have been, if you're curious, there have been 7 presidencies with no vetoes overridden. And the record is, I'm going to call this, the record is Thomas Jefferson, who served 2 terms and never had any legislation, never had to veto legislation at 100% sustaining record. And the same is true for the current president. He has had 6 bills that he has vetoed, and his veto was sustained on all 6 of them for a 100% veto record so far. Andrew Johnson, who served as president for a very short period of time and was impeached, had 15 overridden, and that's a record there as well. The 3 presidents on this chart that have the lowest rate for modern presidencies, Richard Nixon, Gerald Ford, and George W. Bush, again, had to work with a Congress that where their party did not have a majority. So in their cases, they were in the low 70s, and George W. Bush was even 66.7. Only 66.7 of his vetoes were sustained. The reason for this is it's pretty simple. The framers put into the Constitution that 2/3 of the members of both houses have to vote to override somebody, and that's a significantly high percentage of members of both houses, especially considering the fact that your party doesn't have a majority. So, one last thing before I end this session. Other legislative powers not found in the Constitution, 2 important ones are executive orders and signing statements. Every president going back to George Washington has issued an executive order. And these are clarifications of congressional policy issued by the president, and they have the full force of the law. The Supreme Court has upheld the president's authority to issue executive orders. They're typically issued within the context of existing legislation. Congress many years ago gave presidents the power to declare national holidays or to declare days of national mourning in the event of the death of a public figure, or to create national parks and wilderness areas. So sometimes typically they're used to clarify how to execute the law, but sometimes, as in the case we saw the other day with President Obama's executive order on deferred action on childhood arrivals, the so-called DACA executive order, that was sustained by the courts as well, and that was a major policy shift for the government to no longer attempt to deport individuals who were brought here as children and grew up in the United States. Signing statements are sometimes confused with executive orders. A signing statement is issued by a president when he signs a bill into law saying, "It's my understanding this is what this legislation means," or I believe this is unconstitutional, but I'm going to sign it anyway, or this is how I'm going to enforce this particular law. They can be very controversial. Typically, I want to go back to executive orders for a second. I forgot to mention 2 of the more other famous ones. Executive Order 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation, which freed slaves in territories currently occupied by the Union Army. That preceded the adoption of the 13th Amendment that constitutionally abolished slavery. And then in 1941, this is one of the more infamous ones, President Roosevelt issued a executive order calling for the internment of Japanese American citizens on the west coast of the United States. Probably not one of his better moments, and probably not one of the better moments in the history of our country. So going back to signing statements, these are simply presidents saying, this is how I understand this law is going to be enforced, or this is what I understand this law to mean. Sometimes they can even, in the course of that, criticize Congress and what they've done. They've passed a law that he does not like. Okay, we'll quit there. Next time we'll talk about constitutional powers with respect to the judiciary, which are pretty powerful because, as you know, all federal judges have a lifetime appointment, and this is the way presidents can really make an impact on the future of our court system. Have a good day and stay healthy. And if you have any issues, please feel free to email me. I've already heard from a couple from you about issues you're having with respect to taking the exam. So get in touch with me. The sooner the better. Okay? Have a good day. Bye-bye.